And while our focus tonight is to celebrate how much was achieved, it is our duty to understand that the work of building peace is not over.
And they're bringing them back to the ground for you.
That's it. Great.
Thank you very much. So, Tomwich Contusnu, Cahirlach, Corlia Conde, Dunleary, agus Rathdown, Taunishta, Ari, Irhishig, Dinushle, agus a Chordiguel, Ni God Amara, Gormura no Nordum, a Vehanso, Confoita Coroiv, Chig on Okoid, Dinatul Shaw. Okoid, Nwilmid, Eg Comora, Coiked Blian, the Chunra Inon Chesta. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to welcome all of our distinguished guests to this Fianna Fáil commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And it's lovely to say that in our midst, we're honoured to have not one, not two, but three former Taoiseach. An Taoiseach agus Uachtarán Fianna Fáil Micheál Martin, Bertie Ahern agus Brian Cowan, agus tá fáilte Roy Villa. Agus Agus tá fáilte rih gach duine from all around the country. I know that people have travelled from far and wide to be a part of this occasion here in the O'Reilly Hall in UCD. I mean, it's a full house, which is absolutely brilliant. I know there was, as I was coming in and seeing people, I know that you were meeting old friends, making new friends. There was a lot of talk of politics, and there was a lot of talk of GAA. I have to say, everywhere I looked, every corner I looked into, there was a bit of analysis going on, which is very important, particularly at this time of the year. Now, let me kind of describe what's going to happen this evening. We are going to reflect on the achievements of the Good Friday Agreement, and also we're going to reflect on Fianna Fáil's approach down through the years to building peace and reconciliation, and the ongoing work today and for the years ahead. And let me tell you about the speakers that we have this evening. Former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, Dr. Martin Manser, Professor Deirdre Heenan, and our keynote address will be given by Taoiseach agus Uachtarán Fianna Fáil, Micheál Martin. And we also have some really, really lovely music. I know you're going to love it. We have some really talented musicians with us. I'll tell you a little bit more about them later on. Tara Howley and Brian Whelan. But first, this evening is about remembering not just one event and one group of people, but all of the events, the years, and the people who, before and since, continue and have contributed to establishing a lasting peace on this island.
Right through the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s, we had become used to daily bombs, some terrible atrocities, and shootings, and the sense that this would never end.
Every day having to listen to the news. There was a bomb here last night and so many people were killed.
Northern Ireland was a byword for conflict, for violence.
We were Brits out. Anti-partition was the sloganeering, but nothing was being done to deal with it. The ceasefire, the Downing Street Declaration between Albert Reynolds and John Major was just a major, major moment.
It's impossible to speak of Albert without smiling. We threw away any government briefs, any government matters that had to be discussed, and turned solely to the violence in Northern Ireland. And we both learned then that the other one wished to have an end to that violence as much as one did oneself. We equally understood that we may not get there within the time we were both in office. It may outrun us. What we were discussing was in many ways very controversial on both sides of the Irish border. And so there were fierce arguments from time to time, but it never affected the relationship.
I don't think I'll ever forget the meeting that we had in Downing Street on the day that we announced the Downing Street Declaration. I have a feeling that a lot of people thought it wouldn't happen. We were maybe halfway over the Irish Sea, and Albert said, "You know something," he said, "the last fellas that came over here," he said, in the 20s, he said, "I hope what happened to them doesn't happen to us." And suddenly that kind of made the whole thing real.
John Major and Albert Reynolds had built up a good relationship, and the Downing Street Declaration was hugely helpful to Tony and I.
That year when Bertie got elected was phenomenal in that I figured something different was going to happen. He came in with enthusiasm and energy and a great team, and likewise with Prime Minister Tony Blair. And I saw the chemistry.
Tony and I were new, so it was a bit, the kids, lunacy or vibrancy, whichever way you want to look at it, have a go anyway.
Over a long period of time, British and Irish governments had massive difficulties. I mean, they had often been in a bad relationship with each other. And in Bertie, I found a real soulmate.
We defended each other and we took lines, and that was, I think, the crucial part in that relationship.
The two governments working together, that's the key anchor to the peace process. Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair really got on very well, and a lot flowed from that trust that both had in each other. And then you had the American dimension and the European dimension.
Yeah, I met up with Bill in the mid-90s when I was leader of the opposition. He got on well with Tony got on well with me, so we both got on well with Bill. So it was a good team, it was a small team. We were able to work together in a collective way, and that's why we really got across the line and made it.
I mean, there really was nothing inevitable about it. When I got there, I remember George Mitchell saying to me, "I think this is pretty hopeless."
The plan was simple enough. He went to the north to reassure unionists that he was loyal to the union. After all the Thatcher years, it was important that he made that speech. My job was to convince Sinn Féin, to convince the IRA to get back into ceasefire. Our second challenge was to try and get the small loyalist parties to give cover to David Trimble, and to his eternal credit, he stayed in the talks, and people expect him to walk out, and that allowed us then to at least drive the process forward.
There's a lot of hurt in that room. First day I sat down, I looked around and realised that every single person at the table had suffered in different ways. Carl McMichael had lost his father. I had actually lost a very good friend as a student, and the party affiliated to that armed group was sitting next to me.
The levels of distrust were very, very deep.
Trust was in short supply. Confidence was in zero supply.
I had a meeting with David Trimble, and he just said to me, "It's the whole thing. It's every one of the strands. It's everything. This thing is completely unacceptable." Right at that moment, it was pretty bleak.
Trimble was beginning to become a bit nervous. His party held a meeting.
I assured him that I was prepared to move from our position. I then went to Sinn Féin and to SDLP to assure them that I hadn't thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Then I came back to my mother's funeral at 12 o'clock in Dublin, and after the graveyard went back again into the talks, you know, one day at a time.
It was touch and go. I mean, Clinton spent quite a bit of time talking to David Trimble.
Even in the last hours before we got the agreement, I mean, it was collapsing and getting resurrected again, almost, you know, minute by minute.
Mitchell himself had taken the view that he was going to call a halt to the whole thing if it didn't work out that particular Holy Week.
When the final call came through from David Trimble saying, you know, we can go with this, there was just this overwhelming sense of relief.
George Mitchell said, we think we have an agreement, we go around the table, and everyone agreed, and Sinn Féin said they consult, and that was the end. It was a wonderful moment.
I said, look, try and hold it together. Nobody should be crying because they'll say that's what women do. But I looked around the room and the men were crying too. And then it hit me just how incredible this moment was and what we had finally achieved.
The coming together of all the people of Ireland, achieved peacefully and by consent.
They brought to me a mobile phone and it was the Queen on the other line. And it was only when she was congratulating me and all the other people that had been engaged in the creation of the agreement that I remember thinking, wow, actually, this really is big.
That whole period was a sense of history in the making.
John Hume, an extraordinary man, and a lot of the things that we had in the Good Friday Agreement were John's ideas, and probably the biggest one, that the agreement should be put to the people north and south on a simultaneous referendum.
I went to bed that night thinking this was a Good Friday, but we have got to have lots more Good Fridays, especially for youngsters like that who can only think of riots and murders and funerals and problems.
I can remember my first meeting as Minister for Education with Martin McGuinness as the Northern Ireland Minister for Education. I remember that well, where we discussed the policies we were doing. For him, it was a new journey meeting with Northern civil servants, which was a huge thing for him. And those early days were very exciting days, very exciting days.
The relationship I had with Mr. Brown, Gordon Brown, one followed on from the example of Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair. And he showed a huge commitment in various talks.
The chemistry between Brian Cowan and Gordon Brown was excellent also. And Brian, of course, had been Foreign Minister for a long period, and he was very much au fait with the situation in the north, and he had an excellent feel for the issues.
The relationship between the Dublin government and the London government, irrespective of the parties that were in office, was better in that period than at any time in 1,000 years of history.
It has been an island that's been flooded bloodshed for hundreds of years because of the conflicts, and there's a huge amount of work to do.
Building a more prosperous, inclusive and confident society.
The shared island essentially is about, without prejudice to people's constitutional preferences, saying to people, look, there's a whole range of issues where we can cooperate practically, and also to begin to understand, how do we share this island together? And there are no political overtones or connotations attached to it, and I think that's important. It's about really learning that piece about reconciliation.
Remember, the real victory is for constitutionalism in this process. The recognition that it will be the people of Ireland, it will be the people of the North in the first instance that will decide the constitutional status of the Northern Ireland.
Someone wrote to me 10 years after the agreement, a mother who I didn't meet. She put her letter through my front door and she said, I want to thank you for what you've done. My 3 children now can aspire to something that I could have only once dreamed of. And to me, those were the most uplifting words I ever heard.
The Good Friday Agreement is an example of the best of politics in action. Things did change, and they changed for the better.
I'm very struck by, I think it's the late John F. Kennedy said, President Kennedy said, we can achieve peace, but achieving a peace is not enough in itself. We've got to tend to peace, you've got to nurture the peace, you've got to look after the peace. I think it's critical that as we look back and celebrate what happened, that we pivot quickly to the future and look at the economic, political, social and cultural opportunities that arise and really go for it now for the next decade or two.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Tara Howley and Brian Whelan, for that beautiful take on the haunting song Zombie by the Cranberries. Now, we're starting now with our first speaker. You will have noticed him during that video, which was just so informative about the reason we're here this evening to commemorate 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. I want to introduce you to Dr. Martin Manzer, former Minister of State, political advisor, and a key figure in the peace negotiations. And Martin is going to talk to us about the early days of the process and all of the talks that led up to 1998. So, Kermish Svolchanif Riv, Dr. Martin Manzer.
Taoiseach, former Taoiseach, ministers emeritus, Oireachtas members and Oireachtas members emeritus, and good people of Fianna Fáil, and of course fellow speaker Professor Deirdre Heenan. I'm very honoured to be at this Fianna Fáil celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. especially in the presence of the former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, who successfully negotiated it with Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Northern parties, and Micheál Martin, who as Minister for Foreign Affairs negotiated the devolution of policing and justice in 2010 as one of the last major pieces to be put in place. In my view, there were 3 stages of the peace process. Stage 1 was negotiating paramilitary ceasefires, and it took from the late 1980s to 1994, and then had to be done again in mid-1997, but this time much more quickly. Stage 2 was negotiation of an agreement to underpin the ceasefires, otherwise they would break down, as happened in the Basque Country and Sri Lanka. And stage 3, and one can argue as to whether we're still in it, or perhaps we are, if an agreement is concluded, then the implementation of the agreement is very important. Now, I'll deal this evening mainly with stage 1 up to the 1994 ceasefires. It's accepted today at intergovernmental level that Northern Ireland is a shared responsibility of the British and Irish governments, even if sovereignty remains with Britain. This was not accepted in the beginning. In 1969, the position of the British government was that it was purely a matter for them and they needed no outside interference, thank you very much. This gradually changed, but after the failure of power sharing at Sunningdale, the British fell back on purely security solution, time of Roy Mason, or an internal solution, meaning a return to majority rule with perhaps greater accountability through committees. Charlie Haughey, when Taoiseach, believed the 2 governments had to deal with and take the initiative, that there was no internal solution and could be agreed, and the parties would never agree amongst themselves, left to themselves, and also, on which the jury is perhaps still out, Northern Ireland did not work as a political entity. Sorry, excuse me. Charles Haughey, of course, was of northern extraction from County Derry. His father was a strong Michael Collins supporter. In the early 1980s, he wanted, as far as Irish America was concerned, to include rather than exclude and to win backing for Irish government policy, which eventually happened in 1994 after his retirement. NORAID was finally came to diplomatic receptions in Washington and elsewhere. In 1980-81, Thatcher wanted to confine the British-Irish relationship mainly to East-West dimension. She refused to accept that the totality of relationships in a 1980 communique might also include a constitutional dimension, and her determination to criminalize paramilitaries cost 10 men's lives, which in the long term was quite unrealistic. As we can recall in the Good Friday Agreement, after 2 years, as Jonathan Powell said last night on television, effectively an amnesty, and it was quite unrealistic that any peace could be concluded without that sort of provision. In 1982, Haughey reasserted his independence, determined not to beg crumbs from the table. The internal initiative of Jim Pryor was rejected by the SDLP, who embraced instead the New Ireland Forum to modernise and nuance the traditional Irish position. While Thatcher was initially rejectionist, Reagan persuaded her to moderate her position. And the Anglo-Irish Agreement gave the Irish government and the SDLP direct right of input into British policy. It stabilised the electoral position of the SDLP, but that initiative was still based on the idea that agreement between constitutional parties would allow the isolation and defeat of extremists. The Unionists were not consulted, and they absolutely rejected out of hand what was agreed. And in the meantime, 80 to 100 people were being killed every year. And of course, that changed the lives of hundreds and thousands of other people when they survived. The Enniskillen bomb in 1987, which killed 11 people at a Remembrance Day ceremony, was a turning point. And it was in part, apart from the bomb, a toxic, poisonous attitude towards the tradition of people who had fought in the First World War. And how much that had changed in 2016 or 15, and not too long before he died, Martin McGuinness came to what's left of Richmond Barracks and unveiled a bust to Francis Ledwidge, the poet who fought in the First World War, but who wrote a famous poem in lament for Thomas MacDonagh, the executed 1916 leader. And as he passed me, he muttered, "We've a lot to learn." But that is some illustration of progress. Extraordinary thing happened on Enniskillen. As you know, one of the victims was a woman called Marion Wilson, a young nurse, and her father, Gordon Wilson, recounted in very moving terms, her last words, "I love you very much, Daddy," and this went round the world. And I think there was great shock and revulsion, and it led to people asking themselves, must this go on like this? Could there not be some rethink? And it was at this point that Father Alec Reid, born in Dublin, brought up in Tipperary, and stationed amongst the Redemptorists in Belfast in 1969, came forward. He had been proposing a meeting between leaders. Now, that simply wasn't politically possible at the time, but the SDLP, and Hume was always ambitious to go beyond restoring devolution and so on. He wanted peace. The SDLP entered into discussions with Sinn Féin publicly, but in support of that initiative, a low-level Fianna Fáil delegation consisting of newly elected Deputy Dermot Ahern, Richie Healy, Party Treasurer, and myself went up and met Jerry Adams, Mitchell McLaughlin, Pat Doherty in the Redemptorist Monastery in Dundalk. And there was I suppose there was an element of a getting to know you exercise about it. Dermot Ahern, I know, made the point strongly, that violence was unacceptable as far as this jurisdiction was concerned. But this was 2 years after the centenary of the Home Rule Bill, a lot of concentration on Parnell, and one of the great initiatives of that period was to bring together in an initiative called the New Departure, the Fenians based in America, the Land League, and the, at that stage, radical Home Rule parliamentary party. So this was a model of, if you like, a democratic consensus which pushed Ireland's interests forward a very great deal, and the point could be made that divided, whether both in the north, between north and south, and in America, nationalism was weakened, that it could achieve much more if it came together on an alternative strategy. And Father Reid, of course, he had strong support, even if not publicly, from Cardinal O'Fee. And they were not ready, unfortunately, in 1988 to come to the point, if you like, on a new strategy. It was something some way down the line, and sort of, I suppose, a lot of internal persuasion with it. And in the meantime, of course, they'd got a whole lot of weapons in from Libya. So direct contact, which was, of course, politically very risky and against conventional wisdom, that ceased for a period, though Father Reid stayed in fairly constant contact. And then in the autumn of '91, John Hume came to Charles Haughey with a embryonic statement of principles, and I was asked to work on it. And that, Albert Reynolds became Taoiseach soon afterwards, and as I was recalling to former Taoiseach Brian Cowan, when Albert liked chewing the cud, shall we say, late at night, and Brian Cowan would often be there with him, and if I went in there, I'd find the two of them together, sort of talking over the different possibilities. And eventually, enough was put together that was still consistent with Ireland's international obligations, notably under the Anglo-Irish Agreement, to pass it across to London. To begin with, they didn't touch it. We didn't know at the time. They had their own back channel. But over time, we got some reactions, and we realized that we had to broaden the initiative out to include the Unionists, and Archbishop Eames, who was a great friend of Jim Molyneux, supplied 3 paragraphs which needed very little alteration, which sort of helped to bring Jim Molyneux. He was trusted both by Jim Molyneux and by John Major. And then also, of course, the Loyalists. Now, the tensions were very high because there was something in the air in the autumn of 1993, and it was imperative that we contact the Loyalists, or an intermediary for them, a Presbyterian minister who'd once been Vanguard, the Reverend Roy McGee. I mean, the Loyalists, if one read the newspapers, were convinced that the Irish government wanted to impose joint authority or joint sovereignty on them. And it was very, very important for everybody's interests that they be disabused of that sort of idea. And I think that role of disabusing that is still something that needs to be carried out from time to time. Anyway, when Britain's own initiative kind of blew up on them, and rival versions were published and so on, John Major came back to the only thing that still existed, which was the draft Downing Street declaration, and he suddenly, in the last fortnight, decided to seriously negotiate on it, and that it wouldn't do harm. And that was eventually agreed, and that was a catalyst for peace. It kind of put it up to the Republican movement that had been, speaking much in favour of the principle. The principle of peace is to address this, and there was a period of a few months, of uncertainty the government undertook certain confidence-building measures like lifting the Section 31 ban, where the utter pragmatism of Taoiseach Albert Reynolds met with the principled ideological libertarianism of Michael D. Higgins, and so they came together and it was lifted. And then, of course, the visa for Gerry Adams. Now, the British, to be fair to them, mostly accepted afterwards that that actually had been the right thing to do, but they fiercely opposed it at the time, and it led to at least a temporary rift between Washington and London, but that was one of Clinton's biggest contributions. And then, we did eventually, when people had more or less given up hope, a ceasefire was declared, and every effort was made to try and support it. Reopening of border roads, an investment conference in Washington, release of prisoners. A former RUC constable said to me in November of that year, "We do approve and agree with what you're doing on prisoners, even though we can't do it ourselves." Then, as we know, unfortunately, talks, the final thing was the framework document. Now, that was concluded under the Bruton government, but 90% of it had been completed by the time of the change of government. But at that point, the Unionists stalled and tried to, and succeeded indeed in shifting the issue to decommissioning. And gradually there was an impasse. And unfortunately, despite President Clinton's visit to Ireland in November 1995, and George Mitchell coming on side with his decommissioning commission, the ceasefire broke down. Fortunately, not completely, in that there were limited attacks, though the people who died were just as dead as if it had been unlimited. And luckily, the loyalists decided not to react. Now, as you know, the Reynolds government fell, and the argument was made is, well, the peace process is bigger than one person, and, implication being that others would be quite capable of handling it just as well. I don't want to go into any sort of recriminations on what was passed, but anyway, it broke down, and I'm not suggesting the fault was just on one side either. And then it was a question of trying to put that back together. Now, to be fair to Bertie Ahern, when he became our leader, and I'm only going to speak about his period in opposition, he very quickly, went north, met all the parties, loyalists, unionists, SDLP, Sinn Féin, and some of the others as well. So he saw it as a top priority for me, because he hadn't been dealing with Northern Ireland except in the economic front that much before. He got very, very rapidly on top of the whole situation, and he really didn't need advisors anymore. After a short time, he was in command of it. Now, one of the very important relationships that he established at that time was with David Trimble. He first of all met him at a British-Irish Association meeting. an organisation not always looked on well from this side of the water, but it has its uses in terms of context. And it followed up a really, what I consider a quite crucial meeting took place in March 1997. We were still in opposition at the time in Archbishop Eames's house in Armagh. And they really worked out an understanding, of what was needed. Constitutional change mainly on our side, but he also understood and accepted at that time that there had to be a significant and substantive north-south dimension, something that had been, a barrier in the past. Now, Bertie quite selflessly, you could have argued, well, it was in Fianna Fáil's political interest for the ceasefire to stay down. Now, that wasn't his approach at all. His approach was he used every opportunity to try and get Sinn Féin to restore the ceasefire so that, for example, they could get into the talks at the start. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to persuade them at the time. And I do remember a conversation on one of his visits to Belfast. I was walking down the Falls Road with Joe Cahill, veteran Republican who had been condemned to death, I think, in about 1942, but reprieved. And he was the person who needed the visa back in 1994 for the ceasefire to take place. And he said to me, I think we will wait for a change of government. This was July or August 1996. Now, I think, to be fair, primarily he had in mind a change in the British government because, in a sense, the minority government over there had run out of road. There was very little politically they could do any more. Anyway, I've probably gone on far too long. I just want to make 2 or 3 general observations. The Good Friday Agreement owes an enormous amount to Bertie's negotiating, deal-making skills. And Blair would often turn to him and ask, Bertie, what do we do next? And he was able to relate to everyone, including, at a later stage, as we know, the Reverend Ian Paisley. I must also pay tribute, and I hope nobody will take offence here at my doing so, to a member of Sinn Féin who died recently, Rita O'Hare, who was a liaison person, quite crucial behind the scenes, and who was not an apparatchik, but exceptionally intelligent and effective on Capitol. I remember one time, a few years later, I'd written an article which I thought was pretty critical of the Columbia Three. And she reproached me that I hadn't been half hard enough on them. She said to me after the Omagh bomb, that could have been us. And so, now she got on very well with Mo Mowlam, but that, of course, didn't stop the permanent authorities making sure that she didn't cross the border in her lifetime. And I suspect that had less to do with what she might or mightn't have been involved in the early 1970s, and much more to do with her effectiveness as an operator. I'm aware of. I'd have to say I'm not aware of any comparable organisation, liberation movement, if one wants to use that phrase loosely, that has managed the transition so successfully from the violence that their community was involved in to peace. Now, that says nothing about what should or shouldn't happen in the future, but I do give credit to the Republican movement and, of course, to many, many others as to what they did then. And for better or for worse, and this I suppose is part of the deal, they are now part of the mainstream. And as I say, this is said without prejudice to what the future may hold. It is very important not to ratchet up tensions. As I mentioned already, danger of attacks based on misunderstanding. And the tense autumn of 1993, that was one of the most vital jobs, was to make sure that the messaging, private as much as public, was clear. Gladly, the protocol issue seems to have been resolved. I think the factors that people often cite as suggesting that a united Ireland is round the corner, Scottish independence does not seem to me to be imminent. The demographic changes has not so far greatly altered electoral strategies. So the conditions for a border poll, as set out in the agreement, and I think they were set out well, provided implemented in good faith, are not available. And an unsuccessful border poll would set Irish unity back. Look at Quebec. I fully support the Shared Ireland initiative as the way forward, which owes so much to Micheál Martin. And interestingly enough, Gerry Adams, in an interview in the Irish Economist today, said, and I quote, "We want to have it," that's the poll, "when it has the best chance of succeeding." And I think not too many people could disagree with that. Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party, played an essential role in easing the transition from a strategy which was causing us a lot of damage, and damage above all to the victims, to a purely political democratic strategy. And we need to remember that in the new Articles 2 and 3, there's a new constitutional imperative, which is that Irish unity be achieved in harmony and peace. I think we need to be careful about holding on to what we have, and I think, you know, the government have done a very good job on this. I mean, the peace must be kept at all costs, but also it has been very important to keep the border open. That was one of the, if you like, one of the gains of both of the agreement and the single market. And so I'd like them to congratulate the Taoiseach and his colleagues on, if you like, quite literally holding the fort over the last 3-4 years, the difficult circumstances of Brexit, and hopefully we will now be able to look forward to more positive steps in the future. Thank you very much.
Gormagat Martin, thank you for those insights and those reminders of the years, the events and the people that preceded 1998. You know, it was good to get those reminders and to have the kind of the chain of events with the tragedies, the interventions and the hopes that were often dashed, but all of them leading to the 10th of April in 1998 and the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, an historic deal that saw the end of violence in Northern Ireland, which had claimed 3,600 lives and injured almost 50,000 people. Now, one of the key architects of the Good Friday Agreement was former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and he was pivotal in establishing strong relationships and negotiating with sensitivity and care, and he was certainly pivotal and a key figure in bringing peace finally to this island. So, Curramish Sfáilte Rivanish, former Taoiseach, Ir Taoiseach Bertie Ahern.
Thanks very much, Mary. Uachtaráin Fianna Fáil, Tánaiste Mícheál, thank you very much for organising this evening and having me present. I appreciate it greatly. To Brian Cowan, to all the members of the Parliamentary Party and National Executive, past and present, and to Professor Heenan and to Mary, this is your area, Cathaoirleach, of this territory here. It's great to be here. I suppose thank Martin for bringing us through so much of the history, and I think in human history anniversaries play a significant role, and they serve as markers of memory, the calling to mind of an event and a moment, and I think, or maybe something that's important to a group of people or some significance, and I think the exercise of recall serves many purposes, remembering and memorising, and honouring and reflecting, and I think that's what we do this evening. And I think then, of course, landmark anniversaries like decades or centenaries have an even further significance in an outworking of memory. So the 25th anniversary, I think, is something for us all to recall on. I was asked by Sean to go from kind of 97, where Martin was finishing off, but before I do that, and I will do that, Sean, but it was Albert Reynolds who I think was to give the dial the most dramatic twist, and when he became Taoiseach in early 92, he immediately made clear that peace was going to be the number one issue for the party and for the government, and I think, like my situation years later, he had that great relationship with John Major, and I think John Major, I always felt he would have done much more, but he just didn't have the numbers, and he was beholding to others to give him a majority. But I think that work by Albert in 93, which Martin has covered, and not going over that, I agree with everything that he has said, that led to that summer of 94, and the ceasefire followed in August and then in October by the Loyalists. And that was a historic turning point without question, for which Albert Reynolds and indeed John Major deserve great credit. I want to acknowledge that this evening. I take the opportunity to pay tribute. It's very important that Fianna Fáil, as a political party, that we pay tribute to that key role that was played. And I suppose if you went through that 91, 92, was John Wilson in the all-party talks, and then it was Albert in 92, 93, and down the street declaration, and then 94 into the ceasefire. So the party had a key role in all of those issues. The net outcome of what I think has happened during that period rolled on for us. Martin has covered what happened in 95 and 96, and the Dáil record, I think, signifies what we as a party thought about that. So I don't think we have to go back over that period, but there was lost time, and there was no doubt about that. But 97, where I'm to take it up from, I think a word initially about the nature of the talks process itself. I would sum it up by saying that it was inclusive in terms of the parties around the table, and it was comprehensive in terms of the issues on the table. And by that I mean that for the first time ever since the conflict had begun in the late 60s, a negotiating process was making and taking place that incorporated the majority of the main players, including those connected to the combatants, and with the key topics on the table. You all know the parties that were at the talks, and no need to go through to those, but I do think David Trimble and when I met Trimble first, he was just impossible, to be honest. And by the time I ended up, he was a great friend, and he used to shout and roar at me at times, and I always had the trick of looking over his head, and I used to go down the Premiership table, Man United, Man City, Liverpool. And then when he was finished, I'd say, yes, David, now let's try and make some progress today. But he was a very good guy, but he was volatile. But I must give him huge credit. As we go through this period, everyone will talk about what happened in 97, 98. But if David Trimble didn't stay in the talks when the DUP and Paisley and Robinson walked out, there would have been no 97, 98. So David Trimble deserves great credit, because we were going to be stopped before we started, and he really does deserve credit for that. In truth, the early months of the new phase of the talks through the autumn of 97 and into early 1998 was just nothing auspicious happened. The atmosphere was tense, suspicions were high, progress was painfully slow. George Mitchell's patience was certainly being tested to the full. We were all looking forward to Christmas, but that ended up in kind of disaster, because on Stevens this morning, Billy Wright, the leader of the LVF, was killed in the Maze prison, and that led to violence breaking out again. But anyway, Tony Blair and I decided we had to keep going, and we came back after Christmas. David Andrews will remember very well that we came back and we had great hopes for January, and then Gary McMichael and the UDP started engaging in violence, and we had to give them the red card. The IRA went back and killed people, and we had to give them the red card. So we hit the 20th of March, or the St. Patrick's Day period, when we went over and did what the Tánaiste and as Taoiseach did for the last few years. We briefed the Americans of where we were. And quite frankly, George Mitchell, I remember well speaking to George Mitchell, and he said, listen, I want to get back to Heather. I have a young child who I met last year, is 26 now, or 25, and he said, listen, I'm going to pick a deadline. I think we're wasting our time, and we might as well get on with it. So, Holy Thursday, Monday, Thursday is the deadline, and that's it. You're all familiar with the elements of the agreement, so I don't need to go back over those. Just to say that there's a huge amount to talk at the moment about the institutions and all of the setting up of the institutions. I just reflect the party back, but to where the real difficulties where we had, yes, on the north-south dimension, but the constitutional issues were hugely important, and were hugely to Fianna Fáil, and were hugely important to all of us individually and collectively. And the discussions in the parliamentary party at that stage, the 4 Sunday mornings that we spent with David Byrne and as AG and others going through it, was all about the constitutional issues. We were not wound up about whether it was 108 members or 98 in the institutions, but we were about the constitutional issues. And I just think as we go through the anniversary, we should keep a focus on that. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Quickly, I'll just touch on what the week before the talk, so we're now, after coming back to 20th of March, we had 3 weeks to get through things. People started getting life a bit serious once George Mitchell had said, listen, this is the deadline. And we started really discussing the issues. They'd been discussed ad infinitum, but we started focusing on them in a serious way at that stage. And I think our team, our excellent team, started really doing a lot of the groundwork. But I think the decisive moment, I suppose, for us was that we had to agree a paper before. I was in London for an Assam summit with Tony Blair. I agreed a paper with the British government. My last conversation with my mother, well, she said, "Don't trust the British." And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get back to tell her she was right, because what happened was that we concluded a paper in London on the Friday, and by Monday the British said, "Well, you did conclude it all right, Bertie, but now we can't sell it to the unionists. So if you can sell it to them, great, but we can't." So here we go again. We had to renegotiate that period. But anyway, we did that, and I think in fairness to the party, what happened was, just for the record, on the Monday, I had briefed the opposition in the Dáil, and I briefed Clinton, and I on the phone, and we agreed where we were on north-south bodies and all of the other issues, the constitutional issues. But I was more focused on the constitutional issues. But anyway, on the Tuesday, I got this call from Paddy Tehan, who was Secretary General. A lot of members of government would remember Paddy Tehan, with Kerryman, and he rang me up and said, "Listen, the unionists are gone ballistic. There's no way they'll agree to the north-south bodies." Now, we had stretched it a little bit. I think, as Martin Manser would probably agree with me, and we had put in a fairly extensive north-south body, and it came to the stage that the union said, "We're out of here," and the famous John Taylor, he wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot barge pole. I, on the walk on Griffith Avenue, as I think was described last night in the programme, I spent about an hour on Griffith Avenue talking to Paddy Tehan. And Paddy Tehan said, "Wilson, you're going to have to come back, you're going to have to change this, it's not going to work, they're going to be out of here." Then I rang George Mitchell, and I spent an hour and a half, according to his book, I can remember. Also, I remember him saying at the end of the call, "You seem to be still on the road, where are you?" And I said, "Down on Griffith Avenue." He said, "That's where you were 2 hours ago." But I was still walking, but as you know, it's the longest avenue in Europe, so it's it was a good place to be talking to him about. But anyway, what happened, and I suppose this is the serious bit, I had to go back at 6:30 on the Wednesday morning, go to David Trimble, say, "Okay, we are prepared, the government are prepared to change on the north-south bodies. We have to have ministerial control. We have to have a North-South Ministerial Council. We are prepared to cut back on the issues." That got them back on side. Then I had to go to Sinn Féin and SCLP, because we didn't want to lose anything with that side. And then I came back down to my mum's funeral, and then went back up 3 or 4 hours later to get on with it. But it could have went unstuck at that stage. But it was always the problem in the talks, that people would just change their mind every few hours, and you literally have to go through it. Can I just say that I think north-south bodies and the work that the Taoiseach is doing, and as he did at Taoiseach, which I'm 100% in support on the shared island, and building up, because it is building up, contact, and that is the way in the future, because I think there's so much of this can be done. If we get organisations meeting and talking, and cultural groups that you have done, Taoiseach, and this is the way forward. It doesn't have to be a big formal sense. I mean, there's so much that can be done. People don't have to be on the stage talking about it. And I think if we get back up and running, that is the way forward, because we could get bogged down in institutional stuff, where you get practical stuff as you've been doing. I think it'll be far more important. I want to touch on the constitutional issues. So anyway, the North-South stuff worked out, and I think, in fairness, it worked out very much in line with us. The constitutional stuff, I think the key piece of the puzzle, I think, was agreed, I suppose, as we went through the last week of the talks. But just a few minutes on it's critically important, I think, to everybody in Fianna Fáil party, and indeed to everybody on the island, what happened with the constitutional things. And as I said, in many ways, the section of the agreement was always going to be difficult enough for us to agree in. But again, on the matter, we were holding on a lot of important work that had been undertaken during the Downing Street Declaration. The Downing Street Declaration led to the framework document, and as Martin said, 90% of that was done in our time. But the framework document had useful language in terms of summarising the prevailing situation and what the requirement of a new agreement would be. In other words, Northern Ireland was a contested space in terms of the allegiance and identity of its people. And at the heart of the position were two fundamentally different and opposed political philosophies, unionism and nationalism. In unionism doctrine, Northern Ireland was as British as Finchley or Yorkshire. In the nationalist credo, Northern Ireland was as Irish as the cliffs of Moher, and never the twain shall meet. And history has shown that both sides were prepared to take the gun to press their home case, and that happened in the decade leading to independence between 1912 and 1923, and again 50 years later. So a way had to be found, and this was the trick, insofar as there was a trick, to break that cycle. And as a framework, called it to have a fair and balanced solution. And when Tony Blair and I signed the British-Irish Agreement on Good Friday of 1998, one of the key things we were doing, as I've said about a fair and balanced way, was reaching a new balanced accommodation on the status of Northern Ireland. In effect, the trade-off between Section 75 of the Government of Ireland Act 1920, which claimed authority for the Parliament at Westminster over the whole of the island of Ireland, and our Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution of 37, which made the same claim in the Irish state. Both of these claims were withdrawn and replaced by new arrangements that I've described. The Act of Union had nothing to do with it, and in my estimation, and I think you agree, Thomas, the Act of Union has still nothing to do with it. I mean, the balance was this position, and that's how it is, and that change made Northern Ireland different than the rest of the United Kingdom. There is a little bit of drawback by some people. I had to suffer in Boston last week, where I listened to people trying to make a distinction, but the agreement is the agreement, and the agreement, in that agreement between the two governments, I think we have to be very clear. That was an agreement that said we were getting rid of two things, and anyone thinking that you can amend the Act of Union, though I think it's nonsense anyway, and I've told that to the unionists and the loyalists, that if amending that has nothing to do with it. But I think we have to be very clear what we did agree in. The accommodation, I think at the end we reached an agreement of principles on how that should be done, and we got that well done before the deadline. But I pay particular tribute to the brains behind that work, and it was not me. The work on that constitutional balance was done by Martin Manser, and I want to thank Martin sincerely for that brilliant work. Martin spent months on this, and the accommodation was founded on the principles of self-determination by the people of Ireland, consent, the equal validity of the two fundamental identities of union and union and unity. That was what the balance was, and acceptance of the current status of Northern Ireland. Indeed, on consent and a pathway on a united Ireland in the future, also based on consent. And there were other elements of the the constitutional position as well. There were the north-south bits that we have talked about, but I think that balance that was absolutely crucial and still is crucial. There were two other critical elements to setting the constitutional status operation. Firstly, we had to crack the conundrum, which was on one hand ensuring the birthright of Irish citizenship of nationalists living in Northern Ireland without imposing it on unionists who did not want or see themselves as Irish. And the way we did that, and the way Martin and a few colleagues from Foreign Affairs did that, was by introducing the concept of entitlement as a kind of junction box. And it would be the entitlement of everyone in Northern Ireland as a birthright to be part of the Irish nation. And that's why nationalists would be able to exercise their access to Irish citizenship as a birthright, while at the same time unionists who wished otherwise would simply decide not to exercise their entitlement. And the construct got, I think, incorporated into the eventual agreement that the people voted for, that you voted for, and that was that, and this is the wording that we put into the British-Irish Agreement, that the two governments recognised the birthright of all the people of Northern Ireland to be accepted as Irish or British or both, as they may so choose. And that was a masterclass in getting over a very tricky constitution position. The other key feature of the constitutional issues undertaken we arrived at was the whichever government was exercising sovereignty over Northern Ireland, whether in the context of the Union or unity, would be so with rigorous impartiality as between the identity, aspiration and ethos of both communities. So we accepted that Northern Ireland is UK for now, but in many ways this part of the agreement was tended to be overshadowed, I think, by some of the other discussions. The important point I want to say for Fianna Fáil at that time, 25 years ago now, and this was the big issue as we went around the country to sell the agreement, and as a party that always believed in a united Ireland, a new Ireland, that always was prepared to accommodate people, but it was very special. This is a very special night for the parties. We celebrate this and celebrate not just the involvement of the Good Friday Agreement, but all that period that Fianna Fáil were so central to. In many ways, it focuses on the issue that brought many of us into the room, into politics in the first place, because it is in direct line with the thinking and philosophy of Wolfe Tone, bringing together Catholic, Protestant in the centre, O'Connell, Parnell and many of the greats of the revolutionary movement, Pearse, Clark, Connolly, De Valera and Lemass. Fianna Fáil always believed in bringing people together, not bombing people the other way, and that's why we're a true Republican party. And I remember, Thomas, going around the country, and you do too, because all of the meetings that we had as a party at that time, it was that connection with our past and our history and Articles 2 and 3, and the reason the party were prepared to move that, because they saw this as a new way in line with our philosophy as a modern Republican Party of moving on, and you follow that with the shared island, which again is integrating and bringing people together. The early hours of Good Friday, I was just going to, Good Friday was what happened very quickly. I'm not going to go through any detail on this, but once I moved on Strands 2, then the Unionists moved on Strand 1. And the SDLP and the UUP agreed at 1:30 on the morning, 1:30 a.m. on Friday morning on Strand 1. I'll always remember John Hume and particularly Seamus Mallon openly crying that they got a disagreement, because they'd been at this kind of a concept since Sunningdale. This was 98, and they'd been at this since 74, and they, this was huge, and they were so emotional about it. So we strand 1, strand 2 out of the way. Strand 3 wasn't a problem. The constitutional issue we'd wrapped up. And then at 2 a.m. I went into the meeting with Tony, Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness to deal with the issues of prisoners. And of course that was a difficult question. And from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock we were at that, and the argument was whether it would be, Sinn Féin wanted to leave the prisoners out after a year. The British government were 3 years. We probably would have been happy with that. The Loyalists were 2 years, and we sided with 2 years. And then that kind of should have been everything wrapped up, but unfortunately the Unionists had brought in all their parliamentary members. They brought in their executive, and then they started arguing amongst themselves. That went on most of the morning. We were to have the plenary session in the morning. We were all looking forward to doing that about 9 or 10, 11 o'clock. David Trimble rang up and said no, we couldn't get agreement. It was delayed till the afternoon. Then there was several discussions about how we could get over that. I gave a side letter on the implementation bodies and how we would work north-south bodies, and Tony Blair gave a side letter on where we'd be at. I suppose one of the things I'd just like to mention, because it gets lost, I regularly say, and I think colleagues at the time say, that we were very disappointed with the time it took for decommissioning. The reason for that was the agreement was that Sinn Féin would do best endeavours to get within 2 years, and of course it took 5 years, and that's what undone the Unionist Party as we know it, and David Trimble in particular. I felt very bad about that, because I thought if it had been done in 2 years, then David Trimble and the Unionist Party would have been able to continue on, and we would not have spent 5 years talking about decommissioning. We would have been able to deal with north-south bodies, and we would have been able to deal with other things. But I spent 5 years of my life talking to the Chastelane and others about arms, and whether they had arms or whether they hadn't got arms, and you know, on it went. And that was a big loss of time, and it would have been better if we had been able to move to legacy issues. And you know, I say, Tánaiste, unfortunately we did nothing. I did nothing on legacy issues, which is an unfortunate thing. That legacy issue is still there. Some progress made maybe recently, but it's still, I'm afraid, for your time and others to deal with that. And it is, we can't just leave legacy sit there forever on the basis that all these people will die out eventually, because what's already happening is their grandkids are taking up the position, even with more tempo. And I've been saying this to the British government for years, that the legacy is there. And I think people hear that there's organisations like the WAVE organisation that I know that Tánaiste has met, and Alan McBride and others, and who really worked it. And the really sad cases, it's only when you meet these groups, as I've done, as Tánaiste has done, as Brian Cowan did, as Dermot Ahern did, as Martin Mansell did, that you see the horrendous difficulties for these people. But it's still there. But decommissioning should not have became what became, but on it continued. So I suppose just to conclude, I think there you have it. We finally got there. David Trimble, by the way, in the end, he had about 60 people in the room, and I spoke to him about a half an hour before, and I said, Dave, what are you going to do? He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. You give me the letter, Tony Blair's given me the letter, John and Powell has delivered. I'm going to go into the room, and he'd calm down at this stage. He had high blood pressure, David, and he said, I'm going to get into the room, I'm going to climb up on the table, and I'm going to say, I'm going down to George Mitchell, I'm going to sign up, and if you agree with it, follow me, and if you don't, good luck. And that's what he did. That's what he did. He went into the room and he marched down, and most of them ran after him, and he went down and agreed. Now, I'm not going to go in tonight who ran out the other door, but anyway, not a good friend of mine, but anyway, so sorry for going on lengthily, but I think once during the 25th anniversary season I wanted to take just time to set out, particularly the constitutional issues, and I couldn't think of no more meaningful place than a gathering of the party in which I spent most of my life on, and which to make that speech and to thank you for giving me that opportunity. I'm particularly honoured to make the speech in the presence of our party leader, Micheál Martin. Taoiseach, you were, I think, a fantastic Taoiseach, and you did this country a great service for the last number of years. And I, as one of the people who've been involved in this for years, appreciate your quite wisdom on Northern Ireland, and with you as Minister for Foreign Affairs and working harmoniously with Taoiseach Leo Varadkar. I know that the agreement is in the hands of guardians who really care and will protect it safely. So thank you for that. In closing, can I say, 25 years on, we can look back with pride on what was being achieved. The Good Friday Agreement is not perfect, but it has shown those qualities I mentioned at the outset by, I think, constructive, celebrating a Silver Jubilee, about endurance, about resilience and durability. And I think that's really what the agreement is most successful about. It did stop the killing, but most of all, there's a lot of people around now who would not have been around, and I think that's the biggest thing of all. People have been able to live the kind of lives for the last 25 years that frankly were deemed as precious. I saw somebody worrying about a poll the other day that all the young people didn't know all about the killing. Well, thank God that was what we were trying to do. I wanted them to forget about it and move on and have normal lives and not be going around doing, as I did every day, listening to funerals and speeches by pastors and priests and who was killed and all of these things. We want people to move on to a new life, but we don't forget. I'm also been very impressed with the work of Danny Mackay of IBEC, who's trying to build peace and prosperity. Because in the end of the day, it's only when West Belfast, East Belfast, the Cregan, and other places have jobs and they have a real future that people will be able to not thinking about joining up in organisations that are quite dangerous. But to quote a slogan that always comes into my head, a lot done, a lot to do, more to so. I'm sorry I left so many things for you, Taoiseach, to do, but there's still a lot of things to do, and I think it pains us all that the institutions are down at the moment, but I think we fully understand why, and hopefully before too long that we will get back to it. It might take a few months, but I think we will. In terms of the future, there's quite rightly a lot of enrichment about how things might evolve and the possibilities of a new Ireland, and the agreement provides for that. It wouldn't have been passed if we didn't have that in it. It provides the template and pathway in that regard. But in personal terms, I'm of course share that excitement. We all share the excitement of what we believe in. But I have to add a word of caution. The consultation that gave us rise to the Troubles is still undoubtedly intact. True, and thankfully it's no longer, for most parts, exercised through the barrel of a gun, but it remains, and I think it remains real as well. So my plea to this great audience, who I know care about this island and care about Ireland, let us continue to remember the lessons of history, and by that I mean let us be very careful. Not that we can dream of our future and plan for it, but I think we can never forget that the right balance has to be struck, and that we have a significant amount of our neighbours who totally disagree with this philosophy. And anyone who thinks they go away, as people did for a long time, that's just not right. It can only be done by agreement, and anyone who thinks there's any other way, it's just not possible. And I think this time 25 years ago, our quest was accommodation between unionism and nationalism in the context of the wider relationship and history between Ireland and Britain. And my view, friends and colleagues, that still exists. There's no other way than negotiating our way as best we can in a friendly society. So let accommodation continue to be the doorway we go through, and let us continue to engage with each other to listen respectfully to each other. That was how we actually achieved the Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago. It's how the progress that we've seen since has worked, and why we haven't gone back down any slippery slope. And that's what I think will take us through the next 25 years as well. So I'm certain that if we approach it with that kind of an understanding, that this is a divided island, that a divided society, that we have divided ideologies, then I believe that the destination will take care of itself eventually.
Cormagat, Bertie, that was absolutely fascinating and lovely to hear it from your perspective. And you know, when I was doing a bit of reading around the agreement before this evening, I was struck by something that Tony Blair said, looking back on the time of negotiations. And what he said was that he was always encouraged by the fact that he felt that Bertie Ahern and the Irish government were more concerned about the outcomes than the politics. And I thought that's a very, very fitting testament to the work and the commitment and the insights that you have provided us with into what was important, that people will be walking around, as you said, who wouldn't have been walking around otherwise. So, go mí míle mágat a bhríost. Now, we're going to have a musical interlude, and I'd like to introduce you to our performers this evening. Tara Howley is from Kilfenora, which of course is the cradle of beautiful traditional music, and I don't think there is an instrument that she doesn't play and has won many, many awards for both her singing and for playing the musical instruments. She was a piper on Riverdance for many years. And people might have seen her recently on The Late Late Show. It was on St. Patrick's Night with her dad, Pádraig Howley. Now this I find very interesting because I believe that Tara is responsible for the fact that her dad, Pádraig Howley, who is celebrating his 70th birthday this month, has an absolutely massive following on Instagram. He does, yeah. He's a lilter. So what did I do when I heard that? Of course, I went into your dad's account, and he's absolutely amazing. You should have a look. Anyway, he's a beautiful lilter, a beautiful traditional musician, and it just, is so in keeping with the whole area. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you sing. And now you just have to take one look at Brian Whelan. And as soon as I saw a photograph of you, Brian, I realized, well, this is the son of Bill Whelan, who composed Riverdance and Time Dance and so many other beautiful pieces of music as well. And having heard you play, all I can say, Brian, is that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So I'm looking forward to hearing Brian and Tara perform the beautiful Phil Coulter classic, The Town I Loved So Well.
Town that I were happy days in so many, many ways, in the town that I loved so well. In the early morn, the shirt factory hall called women from Cregan, the moor and the bog, while their men on the dole played a mother's role, fed the children and then watched them doze. And when times got tough, there was just about enough, but they saw it through without complaining, for deep inside was that burning pride for the town that I loved so Now the muse is gone, but the spirit lives on. Their spirit's been moved, never broken. They will not forget, but their hearts are set on tomorrow and peace once again. For what's done is done, and what's won is won, and what's lost is lost and gone forever. I can only pray for a bright, brand new day in the town that I loved so well. Margaret?
Thurmagov Bart Vishishinga Halling. That was absolutely beautiful. That Phil Coulter classic, and I can never hear it without just thinking of John Hume and his lovely wife Pat as well, and all of the loveliness that goes with the song and with the people of Derry. Well, now we're going to look forward a little bit now, and to see that the full promise of the Good Friday Agreement is realised in terms of peace and reconciliation and relationships. What are the challenges of today and the years to come in the future that need to be addressed so that we can ensure stability and prosperity? Well, now our next speaker I want to introduce to you is Professor Deirdre Heenan, who is a very highly regarded and well-known author and researcher, and she's Professor of Social Policy at the University of Ulster. So, Currimish Fáilte Nishrif, Deirdre Heenan, on Pull
Thank you. And I imagine the very last thing you want to see at 9:30 at night is a professor getting to a podium with a captive audience and thinking, oh no, here we go. I would just like to say, first of all, what a huge honour it is to be here and to come after the Taoiseachs and to be in the same room. And I just think it is important that I want to talk about the 3 R's, not for 3 R's, the 3 R's, and I want to make that clear. And the first one is recognition. And I think it's very important that everybody in this room recognises the achievement of the Good Friday Agreement. And it is important that you congratulate yourselves and your leaders on a tremendous achievement. And I don't want to talk at length about what the Good Friday Agreement was, because I know you know that. But I would say, from a personal perspective, I was at home watching it on the television with 2 children and one on the way and thinking, this will transform our lives. This means our children can stay here. It means their lives won't be like my life, that they won't be watching, as you talked about, funerals and deaths, and that life will be different. And in many ways, life is different, and life has been transformed. And it is important to say that, but also as I looked at the video, I worked with Monica for 25 years, and I thought, if Monica's in the room, there's going to be an agreement. And those of you who know Monica know that she is a force to be reckoned with. And I think it is important also that we recognise the role of women as peacemakers. So I don't want to talk much about the past, but my 3 R's are recognition, and I talk very briefly about recognition, reconciliation, which is hugely important, and reform. And reform is what I'd like to talk most about, but I have been told that I will be short, so bear with me. So recognition. I would say, as I said, I watched the Good Friday Agreement unfold and realised that it would be transformative. And people's lives have been transformed across this island, but of course, most notably in the north. And we owe a huge debt of gratitude to those visionary leaders, and to you, Bertie, in particular. And I think it is very important that we take the moment to recognise the debt of gratitude that we owe to people. People who recognised that there was trouble, that there was conflict. Those people walked towards it, not away from it. People who left the comfort of their own tribe, people who put peace before personal or party gain. And it is important to remember, and it's been said, peace was neither simple, but it wasn't inevitable. Somehow I think when we talk about it now, it was almost like it was always going to happen. I was born in 1968. The first 30 years of my life, peace did not look inevitable. It looked as though we were in an intractable conflict. We couldn't see a way out, and that was the norm. But I would also say that my childhood, I was born in County Down on a farm, and we lived in a very mixed community. So sometimes I get frustrated when our communities are described as separate and never the twain will meet. In farming communities, any of you here are from farming communities will know that you work cheek by jowl, and that's how our lives were. But that made us all the more determined to ensure that everyone could live in peace. And my parents were very clear that there would be no peace without accommodation. This wasn't about winning something. It wasn't about getting one over on people. It was about reaching an accommodation. And I think also, because it's 25 years, it's very important that we remember those people, those visionaries who are no longer with us. So I think we're slightly more reflective than possibly were at 20 years. And I'd just like to share a moment to remember John and Pat Hume. Remember David Trimble, Mo Molam, no longer with us. But I don't think we should ever lose sight of the contribution of people who did not fear compromise. Of course, things have changed and things came over the horizon that we couldn't have imagined, most particularly Brexit. And it's very difficult to have a conversation about Northern Ireland without having that conversation about Brexit. And looking at that video and watching John Major talking about the peace process, watching Tony Blair talking about the peace process, they came to the Magee campus of Ulster University in 2016. and warned about the consequences of leaving the European Union. They said that if we leave, the constitutional jigsaw will be thrown up in the air, and we have no idea where it's going to land. And our Secretary of State at the time and many of our politicians dismissed it as nonsense, scaremongering, ridiculous. Of course the border could be resolved, but of course the border hadn't really been thought about. Ireland was clearly an afterthought with those who really wanted to pursue this ideological fantasy land against an imaginary enemy who never existed. But Northern Ireland was caught in the eye of the storm. And we have been in the eye of that storm for the last 6 or 7 years. And I can tell you, we're exhausted. It's exhausting being from Northern Ireland. It never seems to end. And so those people who say, let's move forward with the border poll, we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, we need a period of stability. And if we've learned anything, if we've learned anything from Brexit, is voting for the great unknown is a recipe for disaster. So the second R I'd like to move on to, I suppose, is reconciliation. And that is really work that continues and work that has not been completed. Northern Ireland, I'm sorry to say, is still riven by segregation. We are caught in that middle ground between peace and reconciliation, and it remains a deeply divided society. Yes, we have come a long way, and thank God for it, but we still have the scourge of sectarianism, intimidation, and paramilitaries. And as the communities in the north can testify, once sectarianism has taken hold, it is extremely difficult to eradicate. Just this week, I don't know if any of you have watched it, there's a feud going on between the UDA, and they're openly walking the streets in balaclavas, and people are saying, how is this possible 25 years later? How is it possible 25 years later we are talking about people transitioning away from violence? The ordinary people watching this, watching those criminal gangs living off the backs of people, are sick and tired of it. So there is huge work to be done in terms of reconciliation. We need to build those bridges. We need to really address that these people have nothing to offer and put them out of business for once and for all. I would also say reconciliation is not just about two communities. Reconciliation is about the peoples across this island. And I feel like we don't really know each other. I know, living in County Down, I knew little about down there, as we called it, affectionately though. And our only trips down there was when our mother piled us all in the back of the car and took us to Drogheda to see Oliver Plunkett's head, which will live long in the memory and was actually very disappointing because it wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be. But those were our trips to the Republic of Ireland. My mother also, though, was a visionary in her own way. So she decided that her children should go to the best school, whatever that looked like. So she sent her 7 children to the local Protestant primary school. We all had to leave for Holy Communion, which my sister wrote a short story about, saying she couldn't understand why she had to leave her friends for tasteless white wafers. It seemed like an appalling waste of friendship to her. But then my mother sent us all to the Protestant grammar school. And that in itself, I think, in terms of reconciliation, gave us such a grounding in life. I have to say, in the 1980s, it wasn't easy being different. But there was power in the fact that there were 7 of us. And the teachers used to say, another one? How many more are there? Because the normal Protestant family had 2 children. And I think they thought, what on earth is going on with these people? But we came to understand our neighbours. We understood that not all Protestants were the same. We understood Methodism, we understood Presbyterianism, but we understood how people lived in fear. We understood that many of our classmates had parents in security forces, that guns were in their home, that was the life that they lived. It was different from the life we lived. And because we knew each other and formed friendships, those friendships lasted for life. So there's something to say about reconciling us as two communities, but also reconciliation across this island. I mean, I think many people in County Down would probably say they have more in common with people in Manchester, and that's not because I'm a Manchester United fan, or Liverpool, than they have with Cork or Limerick. They understand those British cities. They sent their children to those British cities to university. They do have a cultural affinity with them. And to say they don't really shows a lack of understanding as to how people were socialised. So I think there should be discussions underway about reconciliation across the island and not just focus on people in the north. How that happens, I don't know. I personally wouldn't be in favour of a civic forum, but I think we could have civic assemblies, the length and breadth of this country, to discuss things that matter to people, to challenge myths, to challenge stereotypes, to challenge the view that in fact somewhere down here is a Trojan horse that you're going to come stalking to reclaim your territory in the north, because that's still a widely held perception, even 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement. And I think we have to challenge those sinister motives, and that might be a way to do it. But the last thing that I want to talk about is reform. And for me, it's possibly the most important issue that I feel we do need to talk about. So first of all, I want to say that the principles enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement are sacrosanct. We committed ourselves to mutual respect, parity of esteem, and exclusively peaceful means. And I don't know anyone who would suggest that we should go back and look at those. But what I would say, and I know Bertie and I have had conversations about this, I don't think it's good enough to say to the people of the north, let's get Stormont back up and running. Let's get those institutions back up and running. Those institutions are not fit for purpose. That's the reality on the ground. 40% of the time since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, devolution has been down. That's very difficult for young people, for my children, to look at that government and say, do they work for me? No, they don't. So what happens is my children, who are all in their 20s, are disillusioned, disengaged, disinterested in local politics, because it's a plague on all their houses. It doesn't work. Also, I would say that the system of consociational government that of course worked at the time, and I do not for 1 minute take away the complexity of the work that went into getting that agreement, and of course people would shirk at the view of saying, well, we need to change it. But 25 years later, the north is a different place. We are no longer two tribes that will never meet. We have the rise of the middle ground, and we have to acknowledge a government with a role for that middle ground. Othering other people is not a good idea. And I think the structures need to be adapted to recognise that we are not two tribes. We are three minorities. And a government must give those voices the opportunity to be heard. Of course, there are the neithers, the others, are open to social and political change. And so I think if we look at the rise of the Alliance Party, we might have to say we need not just to get Stormont up and running, but to get a functional government that actually works for the people on the ground. Because Bertie referenced IBEC and Danny McCoy, and the work that they are doing in terms of prosperity is exactly the type of work that we want to see. We want our part. We've had the peace process. We need the prosperity process. We are still the poorest region of the UK. We are the top of every league table that you do not want to be the top of. We've got the highest levels of mental illness. We've got the highest levels of economic inactivity. We've got the highest levels of poverty, but yet we are an outstanding place with an outstanding population. And to go back to Tony Blair, we don't want a handout. We want a hand up, and we need it. So your work is not finished in terms of, for me, where the real work needs to happen now is in north-south cooperation to show that actually we share this island and we share many of the issues, and we have many collective things that we could look at. Unfortunately, I don't want to rain on your parade, and it's not my plan to do so, but many of the promises of 1998 have not been delivered, particularly for my children and that generation of people who honestly thought we were moving into a new domain. And of course, it's a bizarre thing that we live in a position now where those who are advocating change, for whatever reason, change is feared, even though we know what we have is dysfunctional. Of course, those people who put together the peace are very reluctant to talk about change because there are nefarious people who would see this as an opportunity to get their own way, and their ways are not the ways that most people want. I mean, I have no doubt that there are swathes of people in the north who dream of waking up, getting the Good Friday Agreement and putting in the biggest shredder they can find, because as has been rightly said, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt, forget about the Act of the Union, which is just a complete distraction. What the Good Friday Agreement has in writing is that we are not as British as Finchley. We have the right to be British, the right to be Irish, and if the majority of the population wish it, to leave the UK. That means we are not as British as Finchley. No matter what way you want to spin it or describe it, that is the political reality. So I think whatever the merits of any party's decision not to participate in an executive, it is very difficult to justify a system in which their decision precludes democratically elected parties from forming a government. It is an affront to democracy that we are over a year again without a government, being held back by a minority who do not want to form that government. There has to be a point at which you say, enough is enough. There is a growing sense that now, perhaps, we are at a golden opportunity to address some of those long overdue reforms. And contrary to arguments, I think you can reform institutions without saying we want to rewrite the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that's the important difference. The Good Friday Agreement has already been changed. We know it was changed at St Andrews. We know that it was changed to reduce the number of seats. It was changed to give us an opposition that we didn't have. It was changed to introduce a new ministerial portfolio. So change is possible. The idea that the Good Friday Agreement is set in aspect and that we are not entitled to good government, please don't tell me this is as good as it gets, because it isn't good enough. And I'd like to give you... I'm not going to give you a social policy lecture on what the possibilities are, but there are possibilities to move away from that mandatory coalition to a coalition of the willing. And never did I think I'd be standing up here agreeing with Jim Allister, but there you go. That's the strangeness of life. And I do think we need to move to a coalition of the willing. And there are ways to do it. We look around the world at weighted majorities, look around the world at how we can deliver good government. And that's essentially what will keep the peace. And I think perhaps the lack of good government is why our peace process still feels so fragile. There are other possibilities. We have to investigate them to try and ensure that we get a better system that we have. So let me give you an example. Our health service is in disarray, and I know health is a problem here as well. and you are not immune to the difficulties associated with the health system. But part of the people who advocate for the UK would say that the jewel in the crown of the UK is the National Health Service. Free at the point of delivery, perhaps the greatest invention ever as part of the welfare state, meaning that health should not be a merit good. People should have access to healthcare regardless of their circumstances. In Northern Ireland, we've had 20 years of reviews of the health service. Trust me, we do not need another review. We know exactly what we need to do. We have too many hospitals, services spread too thinly, we need a focus on prevention and care in the community, but we have a political unwillingness to do what needs to be done because it is not popular at the polls. Daisy Hill, for example, has long been overdue for change. We can't run A&Es out of every hospital. The issues are exactly the same in the south as they are in the north, but we seem unable to move forward with those. So currently in the north, if it is suspected that you have multiple sclerosis, you may be asked to wait 7 years for a diagnosis. 7 years. That's appalling. You can understand why people are absolutely appalled with the system. Neurology is all but closed. We have a public inquiry in neurology, urology, hypernatremia. Muckamorabi is the biggest safeguarding in the history, scandal in the history of the National Health Service. Dunmurry Manor, where older people were treated in the most appalling fashion, and yet it was never suspected. So people have lost faith in their healthcare system. Extraordinarily for me, 2 of my sons now with their jobs have been given private medical insurance. Of course, that may be expected here, but in the north, where we were told that healthcare was free at the point of delivery, that is an extraordinary policy change. And I finished off the healthcare system by telling you that pre-COVID, we did some research in Liverpool, and we went to a trust that had 2 million people. And we asked them how many people in that 2 million population were waiting more than a year to see a consultant. The answer was 10. They knew those people. They knew who they were. They knew their names. What do you think the number was for the north of Ireland? Any guesses? They had 10. What do you think we had? 130,000 people. That's the difference. And it's only when you hear those figures. Sometimes I think when we hear figures, you get a bit glossed over with it and you think, oh yes, but sure, everybody's healthcare system's in crisis. That's the difference. And the other difference is, in Merseyside, they were determined to do something about it because they felt it was unacceptable. For us, the problem is there is no government. There is no minister. The British government aren't going to change it. So what is going to happen? That's the question I pose to you. How do we change this? And I think in terms of the Assembly shortcomings, they need not to be accepted as a matter of effect. Institutional reform is possible. And I think we have to think about perhaps getting our Assembly resolved, but really saying, how are we going to make it sustainable? How are we going to ensure that people believe that we could have a government with a shared outlook? We haven't had a programme for government in 10 years. We've had ministers who followed their own agenda or their own community's agenda, but not a vision, a shared vision. And we can't possibly have a successful government without a shared vision. So I think it's time for the interests of people to come first, and we have to stop this appalling cycle of ransom politics, the stop-start politics, the if I don't like it, I'm leaving politics. So there is fundamental change required, And for the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, it's about much more than propping up the system. It's about accepting that change is required and we must do it. I think Brexit, perhaps, and the financial crisis threw us off course in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And when you think of a plane taking off in the air and it's heading to New York, it only has to go a few centimetres awry and it ends up in Washington or anywhere. And I think we've gone awry, but we have to be back. We have to get back on track. Our eye was taken off the ball, understandably because of Brexit, understandably because of the financial crisis. But it's time to get our eye back on the ball. What I would say to finish with is change is inevitable, but the outcome is not. And it's up to us to shape that outcome. Thank you.
Will you give a warm welcome, please, again to Tara and Brian and A Song for Ireland.
Walking all the day near tall towers where falcons build their nest. Silver wings they fly, they know the call of freedom in their breasts. Saw black head who cast the sky, where twisted rocks run down to the sea. Living on your western shore, saw summer sunsets as for more. I stood by your Atlantic sea and sang a song for Ireland. Talking all the day with true friends who try to make you stay, selling songs and news and singing songs to pass the night away. Watch the gold waves salmon run like silver dancing, darting in the sun. Living on your western shore, saw summer sunsets as for more. I stood by your Atlantic sea and sang a song for Ireland. Drinking all the day in old pubs where fiddlers love to play. Someone touched the bow. He played a reel that seemed so bright and gay. Stood on Dingle Beach and cast in wild foam. We found Atlantic bass. Living on your western shore, saw summer sunsets as for more. I stood by your Atlantic sea and sang a song for Ireland.
Margaret reached Bishop Holland reached. And now we've come to our keynote speaker, Keynote agus a Chorde. Our final address this evening is from Taoiseach agus Uachtaráin Fianna Fáil, Micheál Martin. Bertie referred to the shared island unit, and Micheál Martin established this shared island unit as Taoiseach to drive and coordinate the delivery of the priorities for the whole island as underpinned by the Good Friday Agreement. And as Taoiseach, he continues to work for the very best for the people of Ireland, for the people of Northern Ireland, and for relationships across our islands. So, anish egon óchoid comórtha so, bhailam go gurnamis fáilte riv Micheál Martin TD, our Taoiseach.
Iar Hishig, go haire Bertie agus Brian, agus Cahirlig an Corle, na Dwicke Shaw, Mary Hannafin, agus Gwynouch de Glair, Whelan Forty, agus Tullav Heenan, Wallam, Tommy Balaha Glair an Shaw, Con Conra an Chine Geste, an Ine Geste, a Chamorda, agus Moraine Lishin, or Mwekus a Yenav, agus Gawail, Le Canary Fianna Fáil. Queen of Fianna Fáil Albert Reynolds agus a maid Yen Session, agus Gohaire a maid a Yen Bertie Hearn agus Brian Cowan, son chos na Siachana san Elan Show. Tommy Fia Vuiak Divshe, Bertie agus Brian, Gurav Mila Mahagov, Asoktan Caradus. The Good Friday Agreement was a triumph for constitutional democracy on our island. It helped end one of Europe's most deadly and enduring campaigns of violence, and it inspired people throughout the world with its message of hope and endurance. The agreement and the key steps which both preceded and followed it involved many great figures who were determined that the people's faith in democracy would prevail, and it involved the steady support of the Irish people. It is a moment in our national story which belongs to everyone. As part of remembering the agreement, it is right that we as a party gather to acknowledge our own leaders and major figures without whom none of the progress would have been possible. And it is right that we gather to again assert our belief that building a permanent peace and prosperity shared by all on this island remains the most noble goal of our time. I would like to thank all those who have made this evening possible and those who gave their time to the preparation of the video which we watched earlier. The video gives a very good sense of the historic days of the Downing Street Agreement, the ceasefires, the negotiations, and the challenges of the years since 1998. While it is little over 12 minutes long, hours of longer interviews have been conducted. In order to make their valuable content available, those videos will be placed in the party's archives held here in the UCD archives, where they will be accessible to historians and to others. And we will also see how we might make these available in some format to party members. Our focus has been on the political process because it is important to stress the essential and foundational role of political leadership by democratic politicians at every stage of the process, a lesson which remains as important today as it has ever been. It is hard not to reflect on just how long the road to the agreement was. A recent academic history of Fianna Fáil shows that as long ago as the 1940s, our founding leaders, Eamon de Valera and Sean Lemass, agreed on the need to find a way of building bridges between jurisdictions. They believed that open and constructive relations were the first foundation for any progress. Unfortunately, their early ideas ran into many difficulties, especially the reluctance of many to move beyond comfortable rhetoric. Even such enormous figures in the political history of our country faced serious obstacles when trying to open up new routes to reconciliation. However, These ideas were eventually resurrected by Lemass in his dramatic series of moves to reach out to Terence O'Neill in Stormont and Harold Wilson in London. From Lemass's time up to today, every piece of progress on Northern Ireland has involved close and effective cooperation between Dublin and London. It is this theme which is a constant in the historic breakthroughs of recent years. During the terrible and unending violence of the 1970s and 1980s, it was so often possible to lose hope. But everyone on our island owes a deep debt of gratitude to those who never gave up, who never lost their faith. Of course, we particularly remember John Hume, a truly exceptional man who always believed that we could find a way forward, that truth and peace would prevail. In the very earliest days of what became the peace process, John Hume used his close relationship with our leaders to open tentative channels of communications to end the destructive violence of previous decades. When Charles Haughey instructed Martin Manser, as we learned earlier, and others to explore these links, it was something which would have caused uproar if it had been known publicly. The relationship between Albert Reynolds and John Major was an essential part of the wonderful achievement of the Downing Street Declaration. This is often overlooked, but it was almost revolutionary at the time. For the first time ever, both governments set out explicitly how they were prepared to find a new blueprint for the future if peace could be achieved. The declaration swept aside the empty excuses of the two extremes to avoid democratic politics. The principle had been established that the will of the people would prevail, and this has never changed. The period between the declaration and the agreement seemed like an eternity at the time. The ceasefires, their collapse, and then their restoration as part of a final push dominated the news every day, as hope and expectation seemed stuck in a form of limbo. It is unquestionable that the coming into office of the Labour government of Tony Blair and the Fianna Fáil-led government of Bertie Ahern was an essential catalyst for reaching a comprehensive agreement. Their close working relationship, defined by trust and a shared strategy, overcame hurdle after hurdle. They never broke confidences. They never tried to dominate news cycles. They were willing to be brave and had the full support of their parties in taking genuine risks, particularly in dealing with people and issues which had caused enormous trauma for so long. In Cabinet, we understood that no matter what issues were facing us, peace was our absolute and unquestioned priority. For every one of us, it was a privilege to serve in those days and to support the truly remarkable work of Taoiseach Bertie Ahern on behalf of our country. With the eyes of the world on him, and working hand in hand with two major international leaders in Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, he showed a skill and perseverance and a determination which helped deliver genuinely historic progress. And I witnessed, along with Brian and others, an incredible perseverance. He was, if he doesn't mind me saying so, obsessed with the issue and never gave up and persevered. And this continued right up to the dramatic and once unthinkable deal which brought Ian Paisley and his party to fully participate in the executive created by the agreement. The support of the government of the United States was essential in first helping us to stand against the violence and then negotiating peace. From President Carter onwards, and with the leadership of huge figures in Congress, there was no equivocation. Democracy and peace must prevail. And when President Clinton came to office, his deep and ongoing involvement was absolutely critical. The overwhelming results of the referendums was a final and conclusive demonstration of the will of the people of this island that violence must have no place, that constitutional means must be the only way that we achieve political objectives. As we see the images of the negotiations, it reminds us of those who are no longer with us, but who are extremely important. To anyone who met him, the Loyalist leader David Irvine was one of the most passionate of all of those involved, because he understood how terrible so many of the crimes had been, and how he was determined that future generations of young people, particularly in his community, would not choose the wrong path in the future. I remember well working with Martin McGuinness soon after the executive was established, and he was appointed as Minister for Education. When we met in his new office in the middle of Unionist East Belfast, there was a shared determination that education could lead the way in showing reconciliation in action. David Trimble will forever have an honoured place in Irish history, not just because of the risks he took, but because his leadership and resilience came to the fore just when it was needed the most. And I can recall at the cabinet table some days afterwards when there was a lot of impatience around the cabinet table in respect of, is David Trimble going to move or not? And I don't know whether Bertie remembers that. And Bertie Ahern hushed us all and said, and he listed out every unionist leader, and he named them all to us and said, all of those compromised, what happened? And what Bertie Ahern showed us on that occasion was, first of all, the extraordinary risks that David Trimble was taking, but that he had the patience to facilitate him and taking time to take the decisions. And we know what happened afterwards. So David Trimble will always have that honoured place in Irish history. And I was delighted last week. And it was very moving and fitting last week in Leinster House that Daphne Trimble was there as we unveiled a portrait of David Trimble alongside John Hume. And of course, for us in Fianna Fáil, we particularly miss our great friends, two giants of Irish history, John Hume and Seamus Mallon. The first heroes of any peace process are those who always stood against violence, who always preached reconciliation, even in the face of the worst provocation. John and Seamus endured the abuse of both extremes for many years, but they never, not even for one moment, their belief that peaceful coexistence and cooperation must prevail. Theirs was the spirit of true republicanism. John Hume's always eloquent words were an inspiration and reassurance through those years, and they remain so today. Being tribute to him, his portrait today hangs in Westminster, and sculptures of him have places of honour in Leinster House, the United States Congress, and the European Parliament. And John remains the only member of the European Parliament to have been awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for Peace. And this is a reminder of how important the European context always has been for peace and reconciliation. Our partners in the European Union have been steadfast in their support for peace at every stage. And when the agreement was reached, they put in place the first ever targeted support programme for peace in the history of the Union. Our joint membership of the Union is to be found in the very DNA of the agreement. So the reality of Brexit is that it turned the focus for cooperation into a cause of ongoing dispute. Even during the terrible days of the pandemic, we have done everything possible to limit the damage of Brexit to our island. I think we should all acknowledge the steadfast support which the European Union has shown for us and the creative and flexible approach they have taken in addressing real concerns about trading relations. I want to acknowledge the work of our own MEPs Billy Kelleher and Barry Andrews for their work in recent years maintaining support within the European Parliament for peace in Ireland. It is especially fitting to have Barry in this role, given the service of his father David as Minister for Foreign Affairs during the negotiations. David's unflappable good humour and indeed relaxed style was one of the many highlights of those days for a lot of us. And of course, the Andrews family is a very good example of how true Irish republicanism has always been willing to evolve and seek to serve all who share this island. 100 years ago, David's father, Todd, served as a senior aide in the final days of the Civil War. Once that terrible conflict was over, he dedicated himself to the economic development of Ireland, helping to create opportunities which have benefited countless thousands up to this day. Of course, 1993, 1998, and 2007 didn't bring an end to the need for tough negotiations. I was privileged to be involved in the negotiations which established a new consensus on policing, and I saw firsthand once again how the British and Irish governments working together in a spirit of trust could keep overcoming new hurdles. What people often forget about the work of Brian Cowan and Gordon Brown is just how much of their time they were willing to devote to Northern Ireland, even in the face of a dramatic world recession. They also understood that Northern Ireland needed a new economic beginning and set out ambitious investment plans. And Brian will remember, again, he was hands-on with Gordon. On an occasion when we were travelling to Downing Street, it was just on the way over, Brian whispered to me, I think we might be getting the plane back from Downing Street to Belfast, because Gordon is intent on doing that. And that's exactly what happened. Sean Woodward, myself, Brian and Gordon Brown, and I spent 3 weeks in Hillsborough after that. And it kind of showed the commitment and what Martin said earlier about the anchoring of the agreement being in the relationship between the British and Irish government, and Brian and Gordon personified that. And while our focus tonight is to celebrate how much was achieved, it is our duty to understand that the work of building peace, as Deirdre has said, is not over. It falls to us to build a genuine reconciliation and progress for all on our island. We need political institutions to return to working on behalf of the people, and the recent election needs to be validated. The people's word must be honoured. We need to work together to deliver prosperity for communities which continue to see poverty levels well ahead of the rest of these islands and which have never recovered from damage caused by 3 decades of violence. We need to return to the spirit of genuine cooperation and push to one side a heightened partisanship which has delivered nothing positive in the last decade. For our part, Fianna Fáil remains as committed as ever to the spirit of the agreement. We will do everything possible to help return effective government to Belfast. We will continue to work to build on the new spirit of cooperation with London, which helped so much late last year and in recent months to reach agreement on critical issues. Most of all, we will also move forward with the investment and the dialogue, which is at the core of the Shared Island initiative. If we want to build bridges on our island, if we want to secure prosperity and opportunity for all communities, then we must commit ourselves to finding new ways to understand each other and to create new opportunities. The first ever sustained programme of research into all areas of cross-border connections and also differences is now well underway. It is challenging many assumptions we have had about services and barriers to development on both sides of the border. It is developing a new agenda for cooperation where people will be able to see the direct benefit for them in terms of better services and economic development. Education remains the foundation for lasting progress. So for the first time ever, we're examining in depth what we can learn from schools on both sides of the border and how we can tackle disadvantage wherever it is found. And the recent ESRI study, as part of Shared Island, I think was extremely illustrating and revealing in terms of the issue of school completion, the North compared to the Republic, and the work that we need to do in the North to get better school completion in communities where the tradition of school completion and progression has not been strong. That is something that would make a real difference to the future of the island. Over 3,500 people and organisations have so far participated in the Shared Island dialogue, showing a real hunger for a new way forward with new voices, young people, the new Irish, to coin a phrase, and indeed an All-Ireland Women's Forum being established. We're also moving forward with the largest ever programme of investment, over $1 billion over the next decade, in new connections across the border, the Ulster Canal to the Narrow Water Bridge, everything from improving transport links to delivering on the urgent challenge of climate change. For Republicans, The purpose of politics is to serve all of the people, not just your own. It is this spirit which has constantly motivated Fianna Fáil in our work for peace, and it remains as strong today as it has ever been. And as we look back at the agreement and the entire process of securing peace, we can celebrate a victory for democracy, which is still honoured throughout the world, a victory for politics and leadership. It is a reminder of how far we have come, and that no matter what obstacles we face, we can still push forward to secure the full potential for peace and reconciliation on our island. Good míle maith go léir go leor óig an táille.
Gur míle mágad, tánaiste. I absolutely, I have to say, listening to your words, I just found it very humbling and also I felt very proud to be Irish and to hear you speak of the commitment, the resilience, the leadership, and just the way everybody worked so hard, and that peace was always the necessary, I suppose, fundamental, and working so hard just to make life better for people on this island, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. And really fascinating, and I really enjoyed hearing about the Shared Island Unit and what I'm sure Deirdre was delighted to hear about some of the initiatives and the commitments that are there going forward. I must say, I learned so much this evening. I found it very humbling, as I said, but also very moving to know that we on this island have come to a point where we are celebrating something really, really important that happened after so much sadness and tragedy, that this Good Friday Agreement happened, and that the commitment is there and continues with all of the force and the leadership and the desire to have life good for people on this island. So I'd like to thank, on my own behalf and on behalf of all of us who are assembled here in the O'Reilly Hall, all of the speakers who spoke so passionately and from the heart here this evening, and also the people who contributed to the video, and also all of you who have travelled from far and wide to pay tribute to the Good Friday Agreement. Thank you also to Tara and to Brian. I guess they're not finished yet. So, gur míle mágah as an oíche, agus gur mágad de Fianna Fáil as an oíche a agrú, agus éve có mothach sin. So, níl fága a gomstal a déanamh ach banachtaí na cásca a gcuireamh. I hope everybody has a very happy Easter, and I'd like us all now to be upstanding for our on the Vian. Ió agah agus go déisih slán a bhaile.